Hello, and welcome to another edition of Focus One. Today we have a real treat. We have Ambassador James D. McGee in the studio. Ambassador McGee is actually a member of our community, resides right here in the Sarasota-Manatee area. Ambassador McGee served as an ambassador in 4 different countries, and most recently he's had some direct involvement in the early stages of the Libyan crisis. Involvement that might give him some unique perspective on what's been happening or what happened in Benghazi and what's been happening after that. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about that today, and then we'll get into some other items such as the newly assembled Obama administration foreign policy team for the second term. Ambassador McGee, welcome to the show.
Frank, thanks. I'm pleased to be here.
Why don't we start out and just, again, we could probably just devote an entire hour to your distinguished career, but maybe you could just sort of give me the 3-minute version of where have you been, how'd you get there, and right up to today.
Sure. I started my public career as a member of the United States Air Force, served in Vietnam. I was a Vietnamese linguist and interpreter, did a year of language training at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. Flew on 471 combat missions in Vietnam, over Vietnam, and from there joined the Foreign Service. Spent 30 years in the Foreign Service total. My first 19 years as a rising, we're an upper-out service, much like the military, as a rising officer in the Foreign Service, and was fortunate enough to be selected as for my first ambassadorship in 2002. I served as ambassador to Swaziland 2002 to 2004, Madagascar 2004 to 2007. While in Madagascar, I was also ambassador to the Comorin Islands, and finally finished up my ambassadorial duties as ambassador to Zimbabwe 2007 through 2009. I didn't quite retire at that point. I came back to the United States and was on the staff at the National War College for a year, and then did my last assignment in Naples, Italy, where I was opening a liaison office between NATO and the United States Navy, the 6th Fleet and State Department.
We'll come back to the Navy and the Libyan connection in a couple of minutes. I want to go back to the earlier decade of your ambassadorial stints. Do you have a favorite, or was one more difficult than the others?
My favorite was Madagascar. It's a special island.
We all realize
everyone realizes from the cartoons what a great island Madagascar is, but it truly is special. You have flora and fauna in Madagascar that you'll find nowhere else in the world. 20+ million years.
It's like its own little separate continent.
A separate evolution there on that island. The one that was most interesting, though, was Zimbabwe, and I was there at a very unique time, the elections of 2007, 2008, where we worked very, very hard to put together a coalition government after Robert Mugabe, the current president, stole the election.
That must have been extremely challenging for you to navigate those troubled waters.
It was very challenging, yeah. As a matter of fact, my wife ended up leaving the country early because of some direct threats against our family.
And did you ever feel any extreme or acute danger while you were there?
No. My wife will tell you different, but I thought it was all part of the job.
Okay, let's fast forward a little bit and bring the focus on to Libya and Benghazi. I think you had mentioned that you served as a political advisor to Admiral Sam Locklear, and just tell us a little bit about that. So you were in the theater in the region.
Right. I was in Naples, Italy. Sam Locklear, Admiral Locklear, was based there in Naples also, as was my military counterpart, Vice Admiral Harry Harris, who was commander of the 6th Fleet. And we covered literally all NATO surfaces as well as the African continent. And I was their expert on Africa. When the conflict started in Libya, we decided that we had to do something positive until we could get a coalition together, until we could get the NATO coalition started. So we actually went out to sea. It was my first time as an old Air Force fellow. I didn't feel really good about this, but I ended up spending 12 days aboard the USS Mount Whitney, which is the command and control vessel. And that's where my direct involvement in the Libyan conflict, and with Ambassador Chris Stevens, who wasn't an ambassador at the time, he was the deputy ambassador, that's where that started up.
So you had contact with Ambassador Stevens. You knew these people, basically. Yeah.
I've known Chris Stevens for a while. I was sat on a promotion panel. I was senior to Chris in the State Department. I sat on a promotion panel that promoted him into the senior Foreign Service.
So you knew him well. One other person I'll ask about a little bit later, though, Gregory Hicks, who was deputy chief
I don't
mission
know.
there.
No.
So you didn't
know
know
the name,
him
but
at all,
I've never
but
met
you never
him.
met him
No.
at all. So let's go through what happened in Benghazi. We don't have to spend an hour on it, but let's just hit some of the I think the more important or take-home points that accountability panels have rendered a verdict on.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a classified and an unclassified version of the Accountability Review Board, headed by Ambassador Tom Pickering and Admiral Mike Mullen.
We'll stick with the unclassified here.
Yeah, I'm going to stick totally with the unclassified. First of all, as ambassador in the country, Chris Stevens was allowed to make the decision to go to Benghazi. Right. His security director, his security officer, diplomatic security. State Department has its own security force within the organization. Most embassies, if not all embassies, have a security officer. His security officer advised him that things were hot enough in Benghazi, things were moving rapidly enough in Benghazi that he should not make that trip. Mm-hmm. As the ambassador, Chris had the ability to overrule him. And I've done this to my security officers. Mm-hmm. Chris said, I feel confident that I know, number one, the people I'm going to see, number two, the lay of the land, I speak the language, so I feel very comfortable in going to Benghazi. Mm-hmm. That was probably a mistake, but we just don't know now.
So he goes, and on September 11, the embassy is attacked.
It's attacked.
It's attacked. It's attacked. It's a planned, coordinated attack, fairly aggressive one. I think dozens perpetrators. It happens at the same time that there are a lot of protests going on at embassies around the world. So there's some confusion. The ambassador and 3 other Americans are ultimately killed over the night of September 11, 12, and all chaos breaks loose back in the middle of a very contested presidential political campaign the following day. Let me just come back, I guess, to the security issue. Now that we've had the better part of 6 months to digest and reflect on some of these issues. It's clear that there was an inadequate security at the Benghazi annex. Where does accountability lie in terms of, because obviously I think it was requested on the part of Ambassador Stevens, certainly the Benghazi personnel as well as the embassy in Tripoli, they all said we don't have enough security here, we need more, but they didn't get it.
Well, I think that's the first thing that needs to be clarified. Within State Department, we have embassies, which are always located in the capital city of the host country. We have consulates, which can be located in large other cities in the country. For instance, we have one of our largest diplomatic posts in the world is in Frankfurt, Germany. Gigantic consulate. Mm-hmm. The embassy, of course, being in Berlin. Right. Benghazi was a diplomatic post, mm-hmm. which really meant it had no standing, no status whatsoever. We have Marine security guards at embassies and consulates, but not universally. Mm-hmm. We have, at my 3 embassies, my 4 embassies, I only had Marine security guards at 1. At my embassy in Zimbabwe. The others, my embassy in Madagascar, you could literally drive a taxi down the street, stick your arm out the taxi and touch the wall right outside my office. Mm-hmm. We had no Marine security guards. So, number one, security is security, and although this is changing, there's a new memorandum of understanding being written between State Department and the United States Marine Corps right now. Previously, Marines were at embassies to protect classified information, mm-hmm. not the personnel. The only times Marines could exercise deadly force was under a direct command from the ambassador. Mm-hmm. When I hear people say that there was a denial of additional security forces for Libya, mm-hmm. It upsets me. Sure. It frankly does upset me, and I'll tell you exactly why. It's because under our Diplomatic Security Act, we have a specific amount of money for Marine security guards, and it's a very small amount of money. Mm-hmm. We have about 1,400 Marine security guards around the world, and about $45 million to run that program. Mm-hmm. There's still probably another $100 million worth of costs that are not included in there. So number one, the Marine program is very expensive. Congress denied us money on a yearly basis. The last time, $253 million was taken from the State Department budget that could have gone into security. So when I hear that State Department did not provide adequate security, I get, let me tell you, very, very upset.
So let me again walk through this again a little bit. We'll just cover this terrain a little bit more carefully. The one take-home point when we're talking about Benghazi, and I'm sure there's people out there probably think that the Benghazi is the embassy. It was neither the capital, it's not the embassy, nor a major consulate, but rather a very small outpost.
And I think the other thing that's very important here, it was not even a State Department outpost.
Yeah.
Benghazi was staffed and manned by another agency.
Understood. And I think the media report said it's a CIA.
And there's no secret. It was a CIA listening post, pure and simple.
So if we were to look at a number of other countries, would you characterize the conditions in terms of the security status of Benghazi as unusual or somewhat typical, in that in other countries we might have smaller outposts that may or may not be State Department run, that in a perfect world would have more security, but in a world that's resource constrained, they're not necessarily the top priority?
I would say it's typical in that we have many consulates, embassies, and other embassy or U.S. government outposts that do not have security. It was atypical in the level of volatility that was potentially there in Benghazi. I mean, the civil war had just ended. It was fairly much still the Wild West throughout Libya. Indeed, Chris and his staff had gone in and asked for additional security for not only for the embassy, but for the entire country. At one time, Chris had 14 diplomatic security officers who were with him. They were pulled back mainly because of financial constraints.
I have a question that you might not be able to answer it, and I'm not sure exactly if it has been, there's been sort of speculation or anything definitive, but the attackers, were they targeting Ambassador Stevens and just, again, had intelligence that he was going to be there and knew this was a soft spot or a soft target, or did they happen to just attack Benghazi on a day that Stevens happened to be there and got lucky from their perspective?
I don't have the answer to that. We think that word leaked that Chris was going to be in Benghazi, and the ambassador is always a prize target. Sure. Always a prize target.
Well, that's, I think, a bit more disconcerting, again, because given the reality of the situation, we're going to have more hot areas, and you're never going to have perfect security anywhere. So when you have, again, your prize target, your top official exposing himself,
I think it's important to realize, though, Frank, that part of the ambassador's job is to get out and interact with all segments of the country.
Sure.
There's no question about that.
You're not the Pope. You're not going to be, No.
So, Chris thought he was doing the absolute, and in my opinion, he was doing the right thing to get out to Benghazi, to other parts of the country. Benghazi was the center of rebel activity during the Libya conflict. Chris was there on the ground. Yep. And he knew the personalities, he knew the city, he spoke the language. So, he felt extremely comfortable being there.
He knew there was higher risk, but accepted that risk.
He knew that there was high risk, but he said, this is an acceptable risk. I think that I'm going to be fine.
Let's go to the next, sort of in the wake, within the next few days. There's controversy surrounding the statements made by Ambassador Rice. So saying that it was spontaneous and linked to the protests that were similarly happening around the world, when that was not the case. And this is, I had mentioned Deputy Admission Gregory Hicks, who you don't know, but I think he seemed a bit exasperated during the hearings in that information that certainly was inside Libya knew that this was not related to the protests, and yes, somebody had talking points that went out by a prominent or a high-level official that made that linkage. What, given your understanding of how these things work, where was the screw up in that process?
Where the screw up was, I cannot tell you. I can tell you this: the screw up was in Washington somewhere. One of the things that ambassadors around the world take exception to is we get our direction on talking points to the media from Washington. Within the country, if we're talking solely to people within the country, to Radio Zimbabwe or TV Madagascar, we have pretty much carte blanche to say and do whatever we wish on those types of interviews. But any international or US-based media outlets, we have to get clearances and talking points from Washington. So something was set up back in Washington. Whether or not Mr. Hicks had input into that, I don't know. I can't answer that. It seems, from his testimony, I'd say that he felt that his knowledge of what was going on was glossed over.
Right, or there were changes that were.
The controversy now stems down to who made those changes and why.
Yeah, and to play almost devil's advocate with respect to the other side, in fairness to Ambassador Rice, if there is a blatant mistake, it's going to come out, and I wouldn't want to go out and stick to those talking points when it's only going to be embarrassing for me and the administration later. So the rationale for the changes, I've had a hard time in that. Again, anything that was done, the idea that you don't want to connect it to terrorism because you're concerned about the election, that's not going to, that'll come out pretty quickly, and therefore that's just going to become a liability, as it did for a little while. So I'm not so sure if that explanation makes sense. And again, I'm curious as to who would go with that information when it was inaccurate.
Well, it's hindsight now. We all know that it was erroneous information. Who would go with it? There were some fairly high-level folks, I think, all the way up to director of CIA that cleared off on that information that may have changed the talking points. I'm still uncertain exactly who was the final authority that would have done that.
I guess one other little tidbit of controversy, just to get your comments or views on it. I guess concerns when some of the investigations were happening in the wake, in particular, one of the congressional investigations, Representative, I think it's Jeffrey Chavez was in country interviewing, and there was a little bit, I guess, of a kerfuffle in that the Secretary's office wanted a lawyer there present at all meetings. So any staff that was in Libya was supposed to have that lawyer there. And I guess for a period, Hicks, the lawyer didn't have security clearance and wouldn't allow, and got a phone call from Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, and it wasn't a pleasant phone call. And he relayed that during his. He relayed that during the congressional testimony, and it became political fodder and all the news. So my question to you is, having a lawyer, sort of handpicked by the Secretary's office, sticking closely to any meetings or any staffers when a congressional official's coming in and questioning, is that normal? I mean, is there anything there, or is, again, this is much ado about nothing?
I think it's fairly much ado about nothing. I have never, fortunately, had the opportunity to need a lawyer when we had congressional staff or Congress members themselves in town. That said, whenever we do have congressional staff, and most of our visits from Congress are congressional staff as opposed to the principals themselves. We do get senators, we do get Congress people, but typically they go to places like Paris or London or Bangkok. You rarely see them in places like Libya or even Southern Africa. All that said, anything that we say to these folks worked on and cleared at State Department. Not up to the Secretary's office typically, but definitely at the bureau level, the African Bureau. The
source of Hicks's frustration?
I have no idea.
He seemed clearly peeved at the comments and that they didn't really reflect what was known, and somebody changed them, and he didn't finger anybody, probably didn't know. They were changed to Washington as far as he was concerned. He just wasn't happy about it, and he clearly wasn't happy about the phone call from the chief of staff.
That was clear that he was unhappy, displeased with what was going on with those comments, and I understand that. Like I said, one of the major frustrations that we feel all the time in the field is that too often what we know to be the truth is not always reflected in comments from Washington.
Let's move forward to the last few days, and Ambassador Rice is now going to be our National Security Council, National Security Advisor. Samantha Power, another close confidant, well liked by President Obama, not so much by Republicans, named as ambassador to the UN. Chuck Hagel, another favorite of the Republicans, not exactly Republican, named as the Secretary of Defense. So these are some provocative choices that I think intellectually are pretty close to where the president is. A lot of capability, capacity there. But during his first term, the president clearly was making his choices, weighing a number of factors. I think the receptivity on the part of a broad spectrum in Washington was one of the factors. Not so much anymore. I think he's just, again, putting together the team that he wants, and damn anybody that doesn't like it. What are we supposed to make of that?
Well, I think your analysis is absolutely correct, first of all. He's a lame duck president. He has a foreign policy agenda, and I think he said, I'm going to put the people in that best reflect and best are able to carry out my foreign policy agenda. I think that Secretary Hagel is a good choice as Secretary of Defense. His first days have been met with quite a bit of controversy, especially over the sexual harassment, the sexual assault issues in the military. Susan Rice, who I knew as a more junior officer back when I worked in Abidjan, right before my first ambassadorship. I was in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. She was the Assistant Secretary for Africa, and I got to know her not well. I'll tell you that she's one of the brightest people I've ever met. She is exceptionally bright. She's quick on the uptake. She has sharp elbows. She has very sharp elbows. She's not going to take a lot of prisoners. We'll see how she works out in that position. I think in the position that she's in, she needs to be able to manage up more than laterally or down.
One of the, again, the peculiarities, they exist in other countries, but certainly in the United States, like it or not, your first term in a two-term presidency is politically constrained in that you want to make your foreign policy decisions based upon what's best and what's in the interest of the country, both short and long term, and you don't want to be driven by political considerations, but they're so thick, obviously. Every president would like to be an 8-year president as opposed to a 4-year president, and their decisions are certainly scrutinized during the re-election process. So there is that constraint during a president's first term, and it does go away to some extent during their second term. What do you think foreign policy-wise is at the top of the President Obama's agenda in the second term? What is he going to try to accomplish before he?
Well, I think that we're starting to see, number one, a shift east. China is extremely important for the foreign policy of the United States. The entire Pacific Rim is becoming, again, it was at one time and then lost some of that luster, much more important for the United States. But China is leading the way there. North Korea is an irritant, and that's about the best you can say about North Korea. They're a real irritant. The president is meeting with the Chinese president earlier today, and I'm quite certain that the intellectual property rights and the hacking of U.S. Cyber attacks against the United States, those are going to be high up there. But I think in other meetings, the president and the Chinese president will get right down to the brass tacks, and the president's going to have to say, rein North Korea in. If you'll notice, you haven't heard much from North Korea in about the last month. And that's because China has been doing a very good job of pulling those strings itself.
How do you think our relationship with China is going to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years? They're just so important, as we are to them. But you go through human rights issues, whether we're talking about Africa, various places within the Middle East, we're talking about climate or environment, there's really, I can't think of an issue where the presence of China isn't a direct or indirect factor. It would appear that, you know, we're not in a Cold War with China, but as what appears to be maybe the two most dominant powers on the planet, in some respects, tensions are mounting a little bit. Are kind of we in for a chilled period, or do you think that there's hope for an actual, you know, collaborative partnership within reasons? We're not going to be best buddies. But,
no. I think there's pragmatism on both sides. Number one, the United States follows what's known as the Washington Consensus. China follows what's known as the Beijing Consensus. The Washington Consensus says, you know, we will not do business with the country unless they meet the following criteria. Beijing says we will be pragmatic and find the natural resources and markets for our goods that we need, and we don't care about human rights, we don't care about rule of law. Those types of issues are all secondary under the Beijing Consensus.
That's sort of geopolitics 101.
Exactly. And you know, can we get along? The answer is yes. I think we're getting along just fine right now. Despite what you hear, I think the United States and China have reached a level of agreement that, you know, we stay out of their way, they stay out of our way. There are areas of overlap that we can't avoid each other right now. I think Africa is the one major battleground, and that's because of the resources that are so readily available, and China is doing a darn good job.
Yes, they are.
Of securing those resources.
You saw that certainly firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, China is a new generation of leadership in China. The second tier of leadership down is even more pragmatic, I think, than those in power right now. I think you're going to see some real changes in China. The real issue with China, and this is the one wild card that I think everyone is trying to keep a very close eye on, China has some internal problems that are going to pop up in the near future that you know, we're not sure which direction the country is going to go. Despite the economic miracle that has been China for the last decade and a half, you still got 65, 70% of the people in China who are living not in abject poverty, but in poverty. You've got a lot of people out there, you know, farming, tilling the ground the same way as their great-great-grandfathers did. And they're looking at, because of media, they see how other people within China are living, and they're saying, when am I going to get mine? So, you know, there's a real strong chance that there's going to be some strong internal upheaval in China, and how will that be handled? I think that's going to be as important as anything that goes on in that country in the next decade.
Syria, how do you think that's going to end?
Badly. Yeah, I don't think there are any good answers in Syria. I think we've had too many lessons from other countries where we became involved. Egypt, Libya. We know that the Assad government is bad. We have some idea of what we're getting into with the anti-Assad rebels, but do we really know who those folks are? The answer in my mind is no, we don't. So I think we need to step very, very carefully with Syria. All that said, too many people are dying there. Too many people are dying.
No question. One more, and this is sort of a rhetorically subtle question. We're not done, but we're going to close in a second. But the next president, President Obama's successor, whether they are a Republican or a Democrat, do you think we're still going to be invoking the term war on terror as much as we have in the last, or during this presidency, and especially the last presidency? Or do you think that we might transition into something else? Clearly, we will always be concerned with terrorism and security issues, but will the war on terror be coming to an end rhetorically, or will it just be raging?
I certainly hope that it does, because I think it's driven us, it's caused us to move in directions that are not truly beneficial to the country. We have a lot of means at our disposal to deal with terrorism. And you know, the debate rages on today about are we becoming too much of a big brother society here in the United States? You know, the president's first responsibility is to protect the American people, and hopefully we can continue to do that without becoming too intrusive. And I think that's a very fine line that we walk in the United States. You know, The rights grid is the rights grid. You know, when do your rights start stepping on the toes of my rights?
That's right. Pardon the pun.
Too many rights, sir. But yes, I would hope in the future that we do get rid of that term, the war on terror, and start calling it what it is. You know, we don't like the way North Korea or Syria or whoever the culprit may be at that time is dealing with the United States.
Ambassador McGee, I'm not done. Have the discretion to go a little bit longer, but there's no way in even 15 minutes or half an hour I can ask you all the things that I want to ask you. So I'm going to ask you if you might be so kind at some point in the future to come back on, talk with us a little bit more.
I would love to do that. I think we have a thoroughly evolving situation around the world. I'd like to think that my expertise, if there is any, is really in Africa, and I think there's some exciting things going on in Africa. I've been doing quite a bit of research recently on North Korea, and I feel pretty comfortable about my knowledge base of that country. But yeah, I think there's some exciting things going on in the world right now, and I'd love to be able to come back and join you.
We would love to have you. You're terrific.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again on the next edition of Focus One.